So the last couple of things I'm going to talk about as part of this tutorial are the different types of sewing machine needle that you can use with your machine, and also the different types of sewing machine feet that you can use as well. So for needles first, in general your sewing machine, when you purchase it, will come with a set of universal needles, which are these ones here. Universal needles are basically what you use for the vast majority of things that you are going to sew. So anything that is, of a medium weight, so medium weight interfacing, polycotton, things along those lines, you are going to want to use these needles. Now you can see when you buy a packet of them, they come in different sizes. So the universal needles that I have here go from 70 to 100. So this represents the thickness of the needle. So the thicker the needle, the more heavy the fabric it is that it can punch through. So just bear that in mind, that when you are sewing you need to pick an appropriate size needle for the fabric that you are using. If you pick a needle that's too heavy gauge, you're going to end up with big holes in your fabric while you're sewing, which obviously from an appearance perspective is not really ideal. So for polycotton you might want to use a narrower gauge needle like a 70 or an 80. So that's universal needles, that's the majority of what you'll be using. You should always make sure you change your sewing machine needle between projects. If you're doing a lot of sewing in a project, then the needle will blunt, so just have a couple of packets of these needles just lying around so that you can just change needles quickly as and when you need to. If a needle is getting blunt, then again you're going to have the same problem of holes and snags forming in the fabric. So instead of the needle punching through the fabric, it will actually just get caught on a particular thread in the fabric, and it will just pull the thread through to the bottom of the needle plate. And what will happen is you'll get the fabric gathering and pulling together as a result of that. So if you do see that happening with your fabric, you either need to change a needle or a different needle type. Moving on, the next one is sharps. Now again, the sharps come in a variety of different sizes. Sharp needles are what they say on the tin really. They are sharper than your average universal needle, which is designed to try and kind of part the fabric rather than punch all the way through it. What sharps do is they just basically penetrate straight through the fabric, so they just cut clean through it essentially. And you want to use this for delicate fabrics like chiffon, silk and things along those lines, where if you were using a slightly blunter universal needle, what would happen is, as I described before, instead of actually passing the threads or cutting straight through them, the needle will actually get caught on a particular thread and pull it and pucker the fabric, which is not what you want. So sharps are really good for things like chiffon and silk and anything that you don't want to get warped by having threads pulled through it. Next, stretch needles. These are an absolute godsend for jersey fabric, knits, lycra, spandex, you name it. Anything that's got any kind of stretch to it. You can even get two-way stretch cottons and things along those lines. So basically anything that's got some stretch to it, these are great because they have a ballpoint end on them. So when I say ballpoint, I mean literally that what happens is when the fabric is being punctured by the needle, instead of it cutting, the needle will just push each of the elasticated threads to one side and pass through that way. If it were to actually snag on a thread, as would happen if you were using universals or sharps, then what would basically happen is that the entire thing would just get pulled down into your feed dog, the entire set of fabric, and it would just get all snarled up and your machine will not be very happy about that. So stretch needles are great for stretchy fabric. And lastly, denim needles. Now these are the heavy duty suckers. You use these for denim, leather, heavy duty cotton drill, basically anything that is tough and hard wearing, you're going to need denim needles. Now denim needles are shaped slightly differently to your regular universal needles. You can actually sew most heavy fabrics using a wide gauge universal needle, but if you have something that really needs something tough to go through the fabric, denim is the way to go. In addition to that, when you're using your fabric, if it's layered up in multiple layers, again you're going to need a thicker needle potentially to get through it. So when you are starting a project, have a think about what type of needle do I need for this, and do I need to change needles while I am sewing if I am layering up layers of fabric or using different fabrics. Moving on to feet now for your sewing machine. You can put different feet onto your sewing machine depending on what kind of function you want to do. There's a rather bewildering array of different feet available, so I'm just going to go through some of the ones that I have here. So the first one here that we have is just a regular presser foot. So this is what normally comes as standard on your sewing machine. So it's got edges on either side and a hole in the middle for the needle to go, and you can move your needle position according to middle, left or right and still have it go within that hole. So this is what you'll use for most things, but obviously this isn't good for certain jobs. One of them is inserting zippers, and the next foot that I have here is a zipper foot. So you can see here it's much narrower compared to the regular presser foot, and what you'll see as well is that there's a little notch on the left and right hand side of it. Now if I were to put that on top of the presser foot, you'd be able to see that the notches roughly correspond with the size of the hole on the regular presser foot. And the reason for this is so that you can have your needle on the left or right hand side and sew down your zip while having the needle close to the zipper teeth. So here's just a little example of that. I've got a zipper just here. So you can see if I put this next to the zipper teeth, you can see that the notch in the sewing foot fits quite nicely alongside the zipper tooth. So essentially you can sew quite close to the zipper teeth and get a nice neat finish without having to worry about actually cutting through the zipper teeth itself. Whereas if you were using this foot, even if you were sewing with the needle all the way over to the left, you're still going to have a gap of about that much between where you sew and where the teeth are. So it just keeps things a little bit tidier basically. This is a different type of zipper foot. This is much narrower than that one. So this is good for things like invisible zips and stuff along those lines, or if you've got a slightly smaller zip that you want to put in. But in actual fact, this is for a different type of sewing machine. This is a Singer foot. So you can see this, the brother feet and the Singer feet are different. So when you're buying a foot for your sewing machine online, just make sure that you've got one for the correct brand of sewing machine. This is a lifesaver. This is a Teflon foot. It's a non-stick foot. So there are certain types of fabrics that metal will just stick to. One of them is leather, another one is vinyl, and there are quite a few other ones as well. I actually used this to sew some trim onto my Popeye costume that was made out of foam. Nothing else would work with it apart from this foot. It wouldn't go under the sewing machine otherwise. So basically, if you have anything that is getting stuck underneath your presser foot, a Teflon foot or non-stick foot is great for that. This one here is a 1/4 inch seam foot. I've barely really used this, to be honest. I found that the guides on my sewing machine are sufficient. Another thing to consider as well is that the width of it is not too far off that of your regular foot anyway, so if you had your needle over to the right hand side, this would actually be sufficient to do a reasonable seam anyway. But basically, if you wanted to do a really precise seam, if you sew with the needle going through the middle of this presser foot, if you have the fabric going along this edge here, that's 1/4 inch basically. It's that simple. This is a buttonhole foot. I've never used this because I do all of my buttonholes manually, so I'm sure it's probably useful in some cases. Basically you stick your button in here, but as you can see it only works for certain size buttons. So for a big button like this one, it doesn't really fit, it doesn't really work. So what you'd have to do for a large button is just basically place it on top like so, and then just kind of hope for the best in terms of sizing it. So it's not that ideal, to be honest. You probably won't end up using it that much, but if you're putting little shirt buttons on, you can just size this accordingly, stick it onto your sewing machine with the correct setting, and then basically you can sew your buttonhole line and stop when you get to the point where you need to. So next we have a blind hem foot. Now this, if you turn the little screw, you can actually adjust where this ends up. Now the point of having this is basically to make an invisible hem. So when you combine that with the particular stitch setting on your sewing machine, which is called a blind hem, it's basically a zigzag and then a couple of dots and then a zigzag, it makes hems where the stitching is pretty much invisible. I'll be honest, I've never used this foot myself. Most of the garments that I've made have been perfectly adequate with a visible hemline. If you're wanting to be incredibly neat and tidy with what you are making, then this is an option available to you. I'll probably have a go at doing something with it for my Haman Khan costume because I want it to look really nice and tidy. But certainly the point of this is to make sure that you are keeping your fabric in the right position to be able to sew it using the blind hem stitch. So that's the main purpose of it basically, and you have to fold your fabric differently to be able to pull it off. So I'll probably do a separate tutorial video on that once I've had a couple of shots on it. Lastly, this is for installing invisible zips. So the way it works is that it's got a kind of loop-the-loop shape underneath it. Almost looks like the top half of a love heart. But the point of this is basically to let you sew over the top of your zipper. So whereas these zipper feet were designed to go to one side of your zip, like so, for an invisible zip, which has a much smaller and flatter set of zipper teeth, you can actually go over the top of your zip using this invisible zipper foot. Now this isn't an invisible zip that I've got here, this is just a regular zip, but it's just for the sake of demonstration. So essentially this lets you sew really neatly on either side of the invisible zipper by just tracking the path of the zip itself. And that's pretty much everything for the erased sewing machine feet. So the ones you're going to be most likely to be using are your basic foot. This is also good for zigzag stitch and things like that because you've got a nice wide hole in the middle. Your zipper foot, which is great for sewing zips without having loads of stitching visible on either side of the zip. That's a different type of zipper foot. Your Teflon foot, which honestly, if you're doing anything with leather or any kind of sticky fabric like PVC or whatever, get one of these. You will be so grateful for it. And that's pretty much the main ones that you're going to use. And then these needles, you're always going to need some of these. It's just good to just keep a bunch of different needles around. And to also own more than one packet of needles of the same type as well, because you will get through them. They do snap if you've goofed up on your sewing machine, which does happen on occasion. And in addition to that, they do get blunt, and it's important to change your needle reasonably regularly. And that's all from me. I do hope that this series of tutorial videos has been useful, and that you feel more confident about getting to grips with your sewing machine. If you have any comments or feedback, then feel free to leave a comment on the YouTube page or on my costume page, where you can also find more tutorials and works in progress shots from me with regard to my costumes. Thank you!